Thanks again, everybody, for being here. I hope you enjoyed the lunch. Thank you to the staff. It was great. Let's jump right into it, okay? The Office of Inspector General, based on my notes, has jurisdiction over city employees, elected officials such as the mayor, alderpeople, the city clerk and city treasurer, as well as appointed officials, contractors and vendors, campaign finance, and lobbying.
All true.
So, yes, and it's been around since less long than some of us might have expected, 1989.
Yes.
A relatively novel part of our city government now.
Yes.
And has had powers over city council to audit CC operations only as recently as 2009? No.
2019.
Wow. And so it seems that maybe from the outstart there wasn't a lot of eagerness to invite oversight of city council.
I think that would be a fair assessment. Yes.
Okay, all right, okay. We'll get to that. We'll get to that in a little bit. We're going to talk about a couple of current issues, some of your office's greatest hits.
Looking forward to that part.
A little bit of you and why you got into this work to begin with, and then some questions about the consent decree, in which I think you have particular expertise, as well as the powers of your office, and then what comes next. So let's jump right into an issue that I think is on a lot of people's mind today, the shot spotter contract. If you've been following the news, you know that City Council has voted to continue working with ShotSpotter. The mayor has indicated he thinks the council doesn't have the power to force him to do so. That will work itself out. But ShotSpotter is something that your office has taken a serious look at, and you have misgivings about how it works, looking at 50,000 records over 17 months. You found rare evidence of it rarely found evidence of gun-related crime, rarely led to investigative stops, rarely led to recovery of evidence, which raises questions about the value of this tool. And yet when the mayor tries to take it away from alderpeople, and when you talk to people in communities, they want to hang on to it. And the latest argument is that it's because people get shot in neighborhoods, nobody calls 911, and people are saved. Based on that argument, do you have what is your take on ShotSpotter? Is that a valid argument and a reason to keep that tool, or is it fatally flawed?
I think there are a number of things to say about this issue in particular. How successful something is depends an awful lot on what you're measuring it for, right? You're not going to grade your star pitcher on their slugging percentage. So when we looked at ShotSpotter data a number of years ago, it was in the context of the fact that the rationale for the city's use of that tool had to do with combating gun crime. And so we looked at its operational value for collecting evidence of gun crime, and didn't find much in the way of demonstrable operational value for that purpose. Now, there was then some discussion of the utility of ShotSpotter to shorten response times. I think the research on that cuts both ways, and I actually am not sure that there's high enough quality data on response times in the first place to answer that question. I don't think that's it. And now we are in this conversation about getting aid to trauma victims, getting first responders to gunshot victims faster, to render aid. That is certainly a good and honorable purpose for emergency response. When we think about the footprint of policing and what tasks we allocate to the police department to do, we have to make those decisions, sort of right-size the footprint of the police department, and then we have to equip the police department to succeed at those tasks which we put inside that footprint. And so if the decision we are making here is that our public safety priority is to get a police officer to the side of a trauma victim first and fastest, then we've got to equip those police officers to succeed for good outcomes when they get there. And so we need to improve things like first aid training and equipment. We should be looking at things like a scoop and run policy. So other major cities, for example, have policies where their police officers will do trauma transports if they get to a gunshot victim first. Chicago doesn't have that policy. So how successful the tool is likely to be depends an awful lot on what we're measuring it for. And when we decide what we are using it for, we've got to equip the police department to succeed at doing that.
Let's talk another topic very much in the news, the Democratic National Convention. And your, I think, first days on the job as Deputy Inspector General for Public Safety was during the protesting that happened after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And you led on a very important report that looked at the police response to that deplorable episode. And you then did a follow-up leading up to DNC, now as IG, and looked at lessons learned from the George Floyd response and the state of the police force as the DNC came, I think, published late May, ahead of DNC. I know you can't talk about what happened at DNC because it could be a topic of interest for your office, but what I would like to know is, based on the progress you saw leading up to that convention, how much progress had the police department made? And tell us a little bit, because very rarely do you get to plan for a big event like that, and more often police are responding in real time to an emergency, a mass protest event of some sort. Does all that prep that they did for DNC, does it translate over into the kind of concerns that happened at a George Floyd protest type event?
I think that's a really critical question. So this work did begin with our review of the city's response to the protests and unrest in 2020, and there were major structural failures in that response. The report we put out in May, as you said, looked at whether and how much progress had been made in some of the major areas of concern, and the answer is a lot of progress. The city made a lot of progress. The police department was measurably, meaningfully better prepared for the DNC than they had been in 2020. Now, that's for a number of reasons. A lot of good and hard work got done, no two ways about it. There was also the advantage of several years of lead time. Good preparedness certainly means being on the front foot not only for scheduled events but for spontaneous events as well. And I think there's every reason to be hopeful that the good and hard work which went into the quality of the DNC response that we saw will position the police department better for unscheduled events going forward. That's a perishable commodity. So that kind of preparedness doesn't last forever. One of the things that went wrong in 2020 was that the last major event that the police department had responded to in a mass setting had been NATO 8 years earlier. And so the people who had been trained to be on the front lines in NATO had been promoted out of patrol, or they had retired or moved on or whatever, and that left an undertrained, underprepared workforce. And so what is now incumbent on the city to do is to continue to make use of all of the investment of training and resources and preparation that went into the DNC.
And what about the difference between a planning for an event like that and just dealing with a huge, in some cases, citywide protest in real time?
Yeah.
Is there a training for that? Or maybe that jumps over to the consent decree where kind of basic policing tactics and constitutional policing, if you actually make progress on a decree, like, is it a different sort of policing that we're talking about?
Yes and no. Good muscle memory is good muscle memory, and you know, a police force which is trained in mobile field force operations knows how to do it with 2 years' notice or 2 hours' notice, and that's a good thing. It is also certainly true that all of the areas of concern identified in the consent decree around use of force and constitutional policing, et cetera, we have to be getting all of those things right when everybody is watching during the DNC and when nobody is watching, you know, at the corner of Madison and Pulaski.
Right. And so let's jump to the consent decree for a minute, because it seems to just track on this conversation. Your office, I think a lot of people aren't perhaps aware, your office actually had responsibilities under the consent decree, objectives you needed to meet.
We did.
Not you
did.
Personally,
well,
but you probably
yes.
ran a lot of that, right?
Yes.
Because you were running
yes.
that part of the department at the time. But it took the IG, I think, 4 years to meet the obligations that...
Well, it wasn't quite that long.
No? Okay. It seemed like 4
It
years,
did,
okay?
sure, well, it seemed, let me tell you, it seemed like a long time. We
Yeah,
did, but we
yeah.
we have escaped.
So the checklist that you needed to tick off was well smaller than that the police department, the Chicago Police Department is facing.
Yes.
And so we're all frustrated, I think, that as of the latest report, there 6% or so of the objectives have been achieved. But when I realized like it took the IG's office as long as it did to get to 100% compliance, maybe the work is a bit harder than some of us who don't live and deal with it. Maybe that's an issue. On the other hand, given the low level of improvement, maybe there's a lack of commitment, a lack of leadership, a lack of ability of the command staff to get the rank and file staff to come along. What is your assessment of the lack of progress so far, and what must most need to be done in order to make improvements there?
Well, look, the work is certainly hard. No two ways about that. But the pace of consent decree compliance is alarming. We are 5 years in, and we are, as you say, in these single-digit percentages of things accomplished. Now, there are a lot of things to accomplish. That is a 799-paragraph court order. There's a lot to do, but the fact remains that reform happens on the street, not on the paper. And out on the street in Chicago, vanishingly few things are different by virtue of the consent decree today than they were in January of 2019 when that order took effect.
One of the episodes that really comes to mind, sort of, which we witnessed in real time, if anybody had the stomach to watch the videotape, was the Dexter Reed case. And Dexter Reed was pulled over by undercover police. He did not cooperate. He ended up allegedly pulling out a gun and shooting, and was then, I think, 5 or 6 undercover officers opened fire, and he did not survive. Is that the sort of episode that a consent decree wouldn't have happened if we were at 100% compliance? Were there things that, like, there's a lot of debate about why was he pulled over in the first place? Pretextual stops are supposed to be diminished because of what is learned in consent decree. What might things have been different if we were, and of course, I don't want to ask about that specific incident, but is it policing like that will no longer happen if we reach compliance, or is it just part of policing that does happen sometimes?
Well, I certainly will avoid commenting on that specific incident, but policing, even good policing, is hard and messy, and things go wrong. The importance of a rigorous and robust police accountability system is so that there is a sort of pressure relief valve when things go wrong. I don't think that the consent decree is not an instrument designed to build a public safety system where nothing bad ever happens. It's a tool designed to build a system equipped to handle things that go wrong in an appropriate way.
And what does that look like when you handle it properly?
Well, it certainly looks like harm reduction. So there certainly are things to talk about traffic stops and constitutional policing and use of force and training and de-escalation and all of those things. I also think it means a robust and transparent police disciplinary system in which both members of the public and members of the department have reason to be confident.
And I want to get to the question of leadership at the top level of the police department. It would appear that, let's put it this way, it didn't seem to be a big agenda item for David Brown. The fact that he gutted the constitutional policing office and then fired Robert Boyk, who was the leader of that effort, for complaining about this, would indicate he wasn't fully committed to the project. Larry Snelling at the post-DNC press conference made some comments that sort of ran along the lines of, okay, now DNC is over, we can get to the consent decree. At least that was my read of it. I don't think he meant it quite as that directly. But how committed is the leadership of CPD and the superintendent in particular to making progress on the consent decree?
Well, I certainly won't speak for Superintendent Snelling. I have found him to be a very productive person to work with. You know, we're in an interesting position with folks in leadership in city government because they are part partners in and part subjects of our work. I've appreciated Superintendent Snelling's receptiveness to the work of our office. Now, to the underlying question of like, for now we've done this, we can move on to the consent decree. That, you know, I think there is a tempting and dangerous train of thought, which is that we can choose between keeping people safe or doing police reform. And I think that that is profoundly the wrong way to think about it. I think we can only keep people safe by reforming the way we do policing.
I can see that, absolutely. The term constitutional policing is thrown around a lot. What does that mean to you, and what does it look like?
Well, I think it's sort of shorthand for a lot of things. As we've talked about, I mean, it doesn't mean that nobody ever disagrees about anything and that nothing ever goes wrong and that there aren't messy things that happen. I think it means a holistic public safety system that keeps people safe and protects people's rights all at the same time. I mean, that's the charge, that's the obligation.
And there's also talk about the need for a community policing strategy. Do you see any signs of as you monitor the work of the police force, do you see any signs that CPD is making progress in either developing or beginning to implement a true community policing strategy?
I think as we look at that question, community policing strategy is critically important. Good public safety work is a hyper-local business. Local knowledge is the currency. And I think looking back over the past couple of years, there have been some real challenges at CPD with organizational shifts toward and away from sort of localized policing. So, you know, there'll be sort of pendulum swinging between block by block community policing and then citywide teams. You can't do community-based policing with citywide teams from where I'm sitting. So I think there have been some real transaction costs in the kind of back and forth there.
And there's also been a lot of talk about police are being asked to do things that are sort of outside of their job description. Some of the mental health, a big part of policing is dealing with people who are having mental health breakdowns, possibly committing crimes while suffering from that, or otherwise just needing assistance of some sort. Should that kind of work be hived off as a completely separate body of work by some other group of people or agency? Or do you need an integrated approach to helping people or addressing the problems of people suffering from mental health breakdowns?
Yes to all. I mean, I think this goes back to the observation about right-sizing the footprint of the police department. There are some public safety functions that belong within the police department and some that belong elsewhere because there are other people and agencies better equipped to succeed at them. That said, we can't have public safety operations in silos. We need an integrated whole-of-government interdisciplinary approach to keeping people safer in uniform and out.
Okay, I promise we're going to do a little bit of biography here. You grew up in the Boston area.
I did.
Parents were a school teacher?
A doctor and a school teacher.
Okay.
Yes.
And you went to Brown and studied, if I remember correctly, anthropology?
I did. That face is the same one that my dad made in response to that piece of information. But yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And then you were attracted to this wonderful city by Northwestern Law School?
Well, you know, you come for the weather, stay for the corruption.
Okay, all right. So, how did you make your way into, and I know then your first job out of law school, you did an internship at the state's attorney's office,
Yes.
and you spent a number of years.
Yes.
Was that something, was being involved in prosecution, in law enforcement, in the kind of work you've wound up in, was that something that you were working toward?
Or
when
was
you
it an accident?
got your anthropology degree, or, yeah. So.
It was always my intention to do social justice work. That's what I always wanted to do, and you know, I loved studying anthropology. Actually, I think the study of human behavior will never go to waste, certainly not in policy work. And I wanted to work for good. And I thought that, you know, my mom had a bumper sticker that said, "If you want peace, work for justice." That sounded like the right idea. Law school seemed like a good way to do that. And so I went to law school. I liked the idea a lot of working on behalf of victims of crime. I thought that I was worried about, I was then, am still, worried about the administration of criminal justice. And I think that if nobody who is worried about a system being broken works inside the system, it stays broken. So it was actually, from my perspective, a pretty straight line from cultural anthropology to the state's attorney's office at 26th in California.
Now I see it. Now I see it.
You just tell my dad.
So I mentioned greatest hits, and these aren't all necessarily your work, but they
I'd be happy to take credit for the good ones, though.
Okay, great. Certainly the work of the office, and you had your fingerprints on a fair amount of it. Just over the years, some of the memorable IG investigations in 2022, disparities in traffic stops in 2023, PPP loan fraud post-COVID. You actually came out with a positive report about the city's handling of homeless encampments. You covered the improvements and accountability of workman's comp in the 5 years since Ed Burke left. I don't know why anybody would look at what happened after Ed Burke left with workman's comp, but there apparently have been improvements there. You've actually followed up on some reporting your office has about Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, and others in the Chicago Police Force that, for whatever reason, remain in the employ of the Chicago Police Department. All of which brings to mind a question for me when I think about it. First of all, tell us about the budget and headcount in your office, and the question of all the places in all of city government in Chicago, where
all
do you
the gin joints in all the world.
Exactly. How do you make that decision about where and why to devote investigative resources?
We have 124 full-time employees and 2 detailed Chicago police officers. 126 positions. We are very, very close to fully staffed, which is good news. Our budget is
just beat out the hiring freeze, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Congratulations.
That's right.
Yeah.
We have a statutory budget floor, so we have a mandatory minimum budget of 0.14% of the city's overall budget, which is a really critical independence measure. And so we are, you know, in the scheme of municipal oversight entities, we are reasonably well-resourced. We could do more with more people, certainly, but a lack of resources is frankly not like the first wall we bang our foreheads against. That said, it is a resource-finite environment, and so you're right, there's certainly, there are choices to be made. Every decision we make about something to pursue is a prioritization decision. Everything has an opportunity cost, because we are not gonna do everything that needs doing. So, I mean, you all face similar decisions in the work that you do.
You know, I always say that the hardest decision we make is when we greenlight an investigation, because that's devoting 1 or 2 people to weeks and months of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the way I think about that is, you know, as no one knows better than the people in this room, the city of Chicago operates at a tremendous deficit of legitimacy with its residents. And I try to think about prioritizing our work in the direction of those opportunities where we can pay down the deficit fastest. Things that really matter to real people in their everyday experience of government. And you know, sorry, that just very quickly.
No, keep going.
One other thing I will say about that, 7 other things. You know, that is like sometimes, but not always, the things where there are the biggest pile of dollars at issue. There's a temptation in investigative work and certainly in prosecution to set dollar thresholds and to say, you know, we're gonna go after the biggest things. Sometimes that's the right decision and sometimes it isn't. I actually think when we're thinking about this deficit of legitimacy and we're thinking about all of the reasons we have given people to mistrust government, sometimes it's like the building inspector soliciting the $50 bribe that leaves people, you know, sort of confirming what they have feared to be true about city government. And so I try to have this idea of paying down the deficit of legitimacy be the animating principle for those prioritization decisions.
So there's some signaling going on. Is like, how will the public respond to this? What sort of impact will this make on public thoughts about this deficit, this legitimate.
Very much so, and that's a little bit of a signaling and a lot of a listening exercise. I mean, I often say we will go anywhere we're invited, and some places we're not, to to talk about our work, but more importantly, to listen to what people are worried about. I mean, we don't know unless people tell us, and so hopefully some of you all have seen folks from our office out at farmers markets and ward nights and community events and church basements and all of those things. We try to take all of those opportunities to hear from people about what they are most concerned about.
Okay. And I'm being signaled that we're running short on time, but I want to get to this before we have to shut down, which is the powers of your office and the question of do you have all the tools that you need in order to most effectively do the work that you're obligated to do and that you want to do in terms of erasing this deficit that you've just talked about. When you look around the country at other people in offices similar to yours, are there powers that others have that you think the IG's office in Chicago should have? I might have a few specific questions, but I'm curious if there's anything in particular that comes to mind for you.
I think there certainly are. There are certainly things I would change. Chicago would be well served by better alignment with the federal law on IG access to information. There is too much room left in our ordinance, in our enabling ordinance, for obstruction from City Hall.
And one way of obstructing is not necessarily blocking an investigation, but sitting on the results of an investigation. You can't independently release the reports of your investigations, is that correct?
That's correct. Our disciplinary, our misconduct investigations.
I'm sorry, okay,
right.
right.
Yep.
Some of your investigations.
Right.
Is that a legitimate oversight power on the part of city government to make sure that you don't go rogue and damage somebody's career, or is that just a protection against whatever their own self-serving purposes are, and should you have that authority?
This is an issue that requires some balance striking, and our current balance needs to be recalibrated. There are very genuine confidentiality concerns in this work. People have well-founded concerns about retaliation for participating in OIG investigations. That's a real thing. People do get retaliated against. There are all kinds of reasons to protect the procedural rights of people who did and didn't break the rules. That said, there's a tremendous transparency imperative. I mean, part of the way we've gotten where we are is that, decades, generations of abuse in government, and so the city has earned the benefit of no doubts. We've given no one any reason to trust anything that happens behind closed doors at City Hall. And so I think against that backdrop, we have a tremendous obligation to shine a light into some dark corners wherever we can.
Some of the sister agencies of city government have their own inspectors general, and they sometimes do very good jobs and other times fall down on the job. I think it would be fair to say that under your predecessor, Joe Ferguson, the sexual harassment crisis at the Park District, where the IG of the Park District actually had some awareness and didn't perhaps respond as quickly as might have been the case. The Chicago IG, no doubt, could have been helpful, and in fact, I think there was some discussion about whether the Chicago IG ought to step in, but apparently the IG can't step into a sister agency without an invitation. Is that okay, or should you, as the Chicago Inspector General, or should your office have the power to just weigh in if something really is going horribly wrong, as happened in the Park District a few years ago?
Well, there are different entities that have different legal structures, different governing authorities. There is periodically some conversation about consolidation of oversight. I think there are some opportunities there. There certainly are some challenges. It is, in all events, true that we have invested a lot in the community, in the oversight community, and in being good citizens of that community, both here in Chicago and in Illinois and across the country. It's like group therapy, but there is much to be said for marshaling resources across the oversight community for all kinds of reasons.
And what about, when we talk about oversight, in policing in particular, there's the the COPA, which looks into disciplinary cases. There's the Community Commission on Public Safety and Accountability, and you. There's also obviously Maggie Hickey, who's overseeing the consent decree. Is there appropriate communication that happens among those groups? Is there any coordination? Is there any sharing of information?
There is some sharing of information. It is a very crowded landscape, no two ways about that, and that is potentially problematic. There's all kinds of potential for duplicated efforts and crossed wires and so on. I often say about this, I have little kids who used to play soccer, and when they're very small and they start playing soccer, everybody chases the ball around the field. They don't make very much progress. And then they learn to play their positions, and they move the ball a little further. They make a little more progress. That's sort of the mandate on this crowded landscape, is for all of these institutions to play their positions, to play to their institutional strengths, and coordinate where possible.
Okay. And this is a question a little bit outside of your remit, but as part of somebody looking for accountable government, for legal behavior on the part of public officials, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the Snyder case that the mayor of Portage, Indiana, ex-mayor of Portage, Indiana, had not accepted an illegal bribe, but in fact had accepted a perfectly legal gratuity from somebody for whom he provided the services of his office.
Yes.
This has weakened the ability of prosecutors to enforce anti-corruption laws in many respects. About 12 counts of the case against former Speaker Madigan have been knocked out now. Is there, as has happened, say, for example, when the Dobbs ruling came down, Governor Pritzker said Illinois is going to be a beacon of hope for people needing reproductive services. Is there any way in which the state of Illinois ought to respond and strengthen the powers of offices like yours or state's attorney's offices or whatever? Is there potentially a local response to the Snyder ruling that would help a state like ours do better in combating public corruption?
Yes, I think there certainly is. I actually think that the sort of public policy anxiety around Snyder is a little bit overblown. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the impulse. I once gave up catastrophizing for Lent, and I could hardly fill my days. But I think that in this particular case, Snyder shrunk the landscape somewhat on federal public corruption prosecutions. It has long been the case here in the Northern District of Illinois that federal prosecutions in public corruption cases were high in quality but low in number. Building federal cases is not a volume business. It has never been enough. It was never going to be enough. And there is plenty of law on the books at the state level to prosecute all of the kinds of behaviors about which all of us are and should be worried about. The state law in Illinois we have bribery law and we have solicitation misconduct. We have really a pretty strong official misconduct law on both gifts and gratuities. There's plenty of law on the books, and are there things about the law that could be strengthened? Certainly, but the fact of the matter is the Cook County State's Attorney's Office could be indicting corrupt politicians this afternoon in the grand jury at 26th in California.
Is it a question of having the investigative expertise, the investigative financial resources? Because, as you pointed out, local prosecutors in some respects have deferred to the feds. Yeah. Maybe there's just not that muscle memory, maybe there's just not that the financial resources.
I think some of it is certainly institutional habits, and it's resource allocation, right? And no one's going to argue that we should not be prioritizing the prosecution of violent crimes, but we have to be able to do more than one thing at a time.
And are they too often conflicted, or, I mean, why don't we see more action? Was it because the feds are so good at it?
Well, as a former state's attorney, no. Worried about getting their wingtips dirty. No, I think it is. It's a little bit of all of these things. It's resource allocation. It's institutional habits. It's institutional expertise. But there are tremendous opportunities out there for the taking, and I think that's a good news story. Political will is in some ways more susceptible to change than the federal law.
Okay, so I've got one more question for you, and be ready, okay?
Well, okay.
So in all the deep research I did about you and your background, apparently you grew up and your mother used to read to you the story Miss Rumphius. who I guess would be responsible for something about being responsible for doing something that makes the world more beautiful.
Yes.
And she would spread flower seeds in order to make the lupine seeds, I think the name of the flower was.
Yes.
Bringing you back, maybe, but to make the world more beautiful. And
Yes.
I'm not sure it's the remit of your office to make the world more beautiful, but when you think about, project forward to the time at which you leave this office.
I do that sometimes.
And I know, well, you actually backed the move to put a limitation on the office, 2 terms.
Absolutely.
And it's 2 terms and out.
Yep.
In fact, before I get to Ms. Rumpus, why 2 terms? Why is that a good thing? Because your predecessor served 12 years, and there are some who might say Joe Ferguson did some of his very best work in those last couple of years, and after he had really learned the lay of the land. Others might view it differently. I think Mayor Lawyer Lightfoot might have viewed it differently, that maybe he stayed too long. But why does a limitation on service make sense?
I think term limits are, at bottom, a good government notion. I frankly think most positions of public trust should have term limits for lots of reasons. There certainly are some things about this job in particular which I think make that important. We have access, this is a hugely sensitive and confidential position. Success in this work is tremendously dependent on carefully calibrated relationships with other people in the city. If those relationships are either too cozy or too acrimonious over time, I think that compromises the work. The director of the FBI has a term limit for a reason. So I think there are some specific things. I think more generally, the highest obligation for those of us lucky enough to serve in these jobs is to be stewards of the institutions in which we serve, and that bodes for stable, predictable, orderly transition. And I think term limits are important and a good idea.
Yeah, and I would add, in case there's any doubt, the BGA policy team backed the imposition of term limits on the office, and for the same
Which I did
reason.
not take personally.
Right. So let's get back to Ms. Rumphius.
Yeah, that's good research,
yeah.
David. You should consider a career in journalism. That's very good.
I just might do that. So what is the mark that you want to leave? What are the beautiful things that you want to leave behind in this office? Like you said, you're a steward of an office. You hold this office. How do you want the office, what should the office look like when you're done with your work?
It delights me that Ms. Rumphius continues to be part of the conversation about this. Those of you who have not read Ms. Rumphius to your children, please do so. It is about the idea that we all have an obligation to make the world more beautiful, and that looks different for everybody, and everybody has a different thing. I am a true believer in the power of local government to do good. I love this city. It's the home I chose. It's the place my children are from. And I will feel as though I have sort of lived up to Ms. Rumphius if, when I'm done here, we have built a city government that looks a little bit more like the one Chicagoans deserve.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate you being willing to do this. I think this is a crowd of people who I think all of us probably have a little bit of Miss Rumphius in us, or you wouldn't be here today. You've heard a lot about what the BGA is trying to do about transparency, equity, and accountability in government, and in that sense, I think a lot of our interests and the interests of everybody in this room align. These days, getting 300 or so people in a room like this post-COVID is rare indeed, and the fact that you took the effort to come here today does speak to your commitment to the same work that we're all talking about. Thank you for that. Thank you for your support, financial support, your moral support, your encouragement of our work, and your appreciation for the work that we're doing. The partners who are here, thank you for being great partners and for helping us do more of the kind of work that we would be able to do on our own. I am asked to advise you all that there are plants on your table, and what are they supposed to do, arm wrestle for them? Okay, arm wrestle. The people who want the plants, raise your hand and then arm wrestle. And the winner gets to take, I guess, I don't know. Maybe that's not fair. Maybe it should be a battle of wits. You all decide amongst yourselves. Yeah, I didn't want to, so thank you all for coming, and please think about attending our October event on pensions, and join us again next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.